I'm going to use this here. Hello, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're having a great day. We're going to jump right into it for the sake of time. I'm going to introduce the panel here. First, we have Dr. Francisco J. Gariarte, who is an associate professor, Department of American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of New Mexico. His paper that he focuses on border policing, gentrification, and their effects on transsex workers at the Juarez and Mexico border, the time period between 1980s and 2006. We also have next to him Dr. Bernadine Hernandez, Associate Professor of the Department of English at the University of New Mexico. And next, we also have Luis Romero, Dr. Luis Romero from here, Texas Christian University, who is part of the Crest Department. I don't have the titles of their work, so if you can introduce the title of your work that you're working on when you're presented, but we'll jump right into it with Francisco. Perfect.
I do have slides. I emailed them. Yes.
Our apologies, yes. So it's okay. We're just on now.
Okay. I think we are ready. So thank you all so very much. Thank you to the organizers. Most especially, it's been a pleasure to work with Dr. McCormick on this and kind of get everything going on this conference. Been really excited to be here. My paper today is entitled, let me see if I remember the title, Teresa Margoles's Pista de Baile, Trans-Detrital Affect in Juarez, Mexico. So this paper is part of a larger project, book chapter from my next book in progress. And so I have three framing questions that I'm going to answer in part for you, not in full because I don't have time to go into the whole chapter, but they frame what will be the chapter for my next book, which is called Dolores Gender. So the first question, that we can move on to the next slide, is how have various state actors, including federal, state, and local authorities on both sides of the Juarez and Paso border, sought to impose regulations and enforce law enforcement measures on trans subjects at the border? 2, additionally, how have trans communities reacted to, been impacted by, and occasionally subverted the effects of specific law enforcement goals and methods? And 3, what does the process of detrition in the wake of policing look like, and what affects can we mine from sifting through the detritus of devastation of life and life chances to understand trans life? So, to begin question 1. To answer this first question, I have undertaken research to track policies aimed at policing trans sex workers on both sides of the border from the mid-1980s to the present. These policies are often official and are often unofficial or involve sophisticated inter-agency cooperation. I have found that the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the early moral panic about the spread of AIDS in the early 1980s provided the animus for implementing these policing strategies. On the US side is the example of Operation John in El Paso, Juarez. In June of 1990, a collaborative sting operation between the El Paso PD Vice Squad and the US Border Patrol was launched. Under the guise of ridding El Paso's downtown of border vice officers went undercover and sought out to entrap undocumented trans sex workers and then immediately handed them over to Border Patrol for deportation. This closely overlaps with increased news coverage on HIV/AIDS panic in local El Paso newspapers, which linked infection to bodies of undocumented sex workers from Mexico. These news stories led to an increase of hate-motivated violence toward trans women in El Paso. The moral panic about prostitution plaguing El Paso's downtown would become an impetus for an implementation of one of the U.S. Customs and Border Enforcement's most used strategies that we know today as enforcement through deterrence. The current most palpable relevant example of prevention through deterrence being Governor Abbott's use of the National Guard to lay razor wire on the U.S.-Mexico border here in Texas. On September 20th, 1993, U.S. Border Patrol Sector Chief Silvestre Reyes launched Operation Blockade, which was a high-visibility tactic that stationed agents at 50-yard intervals along a 20-mile boundary between El Paso and Juarez to deter crossings. Reyes aimed to strategically reduce the illegal crossings from Mexico of, quote, street beggars, burglars, and others who commit crimes, end quote. Cynthia Bejarano and Gilberto Rosas have noted that such strategies conflate border violence as threats such as terrorism, undocumented immigrants, and drug trafficking. Both the approach of Operation Blockade by Border Patrol Sector Chief Silvestre in the early 1990s and Abbott's approach require acquiescence from the public at large and collaboration between federal, state, and local law enforcement. However, here I build on the work of Mexican scholar Sayek Valencia and interject that the threat of contagion, first HIV/AIDS, and second gender and sexual non-normativity, also take the shape of threats to the US that need containment. These sex workers were indeed contained after the launch of Operation Blockade. The name was later changed to Operation Hold the Line to be more politically palpable. Sex workers were effectively stopped from crossing into the US for work, even though working in the US was largely safer and more profitable. Though I have engaged with the impact of sex workers entering the US from Mexico on the border and border tactics and policies on the US side of the border, I now turn to Juarez for a more in-depth engagement with how trans sex workers living in Juarez's Centro Histórico have experienced policing, displacement, and death. Therefore, before delving into, I'm confused with my numbering, and death, yes. Therefore, before delving into the visual, as I will engage some photographs, I'm going to provide an overview of the social political context from which this series of photographs was produced. So now on to question number 2, please. All right, so between 2006 and 2011, Juarez was often described as a war zone, with the working poor of the city bearing the brunt of the newly elected President Felipe Calderon's war against organized crime. In 2008, Operation Chihuahua began with the deployment of federal police and the Mexican army to the state of Chihuahua to oversee Juarez's security, thrusting Juarez into a period in its history where between 2008 and 2012, the city lost 20% of its population, employment rates dropped 20%, extortions and kidnappings contributed to the closings of thousands of local businesses and the abandonment of more than 25% of businesses, while the homicide rate for young men jumped by 400%. I include this rate because more often than not, female trans sex workers were categorized as men. At this time, and with the entrance of a new president, it was declared that the war was over in Juarez. Juarez Centro Histórico, and for those that don't know, the Centro Histórico is immediately as you cross the main bridge to enter Juarez, was the hub of violence and suffered the most carnage and economic devastation following the 2006 drug war. And in the wake of the end of the war, Juarez city officials also moved forward to pursue a fresh start in the city center. According to geographer Melissa Wright, local business and political leaders teamed up with global investors to embark on the city's most ambitious gentrification plan in the city's history. The mayor behind that plan, Hector Munguia, declared it, quote, the rescue of Ciudad Juarez. The motivation behind the urban renewal project was to renovate and repopulate the city center. At the center of the plan was to destruct the historical structures in the centro and replace them with high-end condos, boutiques, and restaurants. The Centro Histórico in Juarez was home to many of the city's historic nightclubs and bars that date back to Prohibition, and of course, the bar made famous by Juan Gabriel, El Noa Noa, which is now a parking lot. So within the Centro Histórico, the street La Mariscal was one of the city's zonas de tolerancia, or red light district, and it was the first target of the redevelopment plan starting in 2008. So starting in 2008, investors bought properties through voluntary exchanges or through eminent domain, and many were demolished. But the global economic crisis of 2008-2009 halted the project, and dozens of buildings lay in ruins. Next slide. That was perfect. By 2010, a Juarez-based reporter described La Mariscal as looking bombed out. La Mariscal has traditionally been the zone in Juarez where sex workers did business, primarily in the bars, within and in proximity to La Mariscal and the Centro Histórico. Unlike previous attempts to clear the city of sex workers, the city was met with pushback by bar owners, who advocated on behalf of the value of sex work to the tourist industry and resisted selling to outside investors. The urban renewal project that decimated La Mariscal was made possible through the hiring of police chief Juan Lezaola in 2008, who upon arrival to Juarez announced a plan to secure the city through an intensification of police foot patrols and with a broken windows approach, influenced by Giuliani's cleanup of Times Square. The first area on his agenda was to clean up with the Centro Histórico. Poor youth, especially young men, were targeted as part of a coordinated effort to combat sex trafficking. This resulted in the raids of brothels, restaurants, and cantinas in the Centro Histórico, and an era of public brutalization of the Centro Histórico's youth. Next on Chief Leosola's list was to target informal vendors in the centro of used clothes, electronics, and other goods. These vendors were characterized by Leosola as fronts for organized crime and general delinquency. The policing and land grabbing tactics used by the city of Juarez effectively disemployed the city's working poor, effectively removing both those employed in the Centro Histórico and those who relied on the used goods and markets in the area to buy goods at low costs. This new era of policing in Juarez that resulted in the literal destruction of places of work, literal destruction of places of work for trans sex workers. This displaced an entire labor force of sex workers who were effectively thrust into perilous living and working conditions. According to Melissa Wright, Juarez was not a dying city, but rather a murdered one. At this point, I can move on to the dead subject that is featured most prominently in Margoles's Pista de Baile, La Mariscal de Juarez. At this point, I turn to the visual and focus on selected works by Mexican artist Teresa Margoles, specifically her installation entitled Pista de Baile, or which translates to dance floors. So between 2006 and 2016, Margoles focused her artistic practice on Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and this series of photographs are often installed in large-scale photographs, like large-scale in terms of like at least 4 feet by 6 feet. The work has been featured in shows both in Europe and in North America, and the work itself features on transgender sex workers with whom the artists work closely, whom she photographed and also documented their narratives. The work documents the most recent and successful attempt by Ciudad Juárez to regenerate and restore the historic center, or Centro Histórico, and this is where the photos of these women were taken. Margolis' work highlights the destruction and cleansing of downtown by centering the displacement of sex workers and low-income residents from the city center. Since the 1990s, Ciudad Juárez has been most associated with state-sponsored impunity and complicity with various forms of violence that are interconnected, feminicide and narco-drug-related violence. Margolis' usual artistic practice most often incorporates physical remnants of violent crimes resulting from political corruption and social exclusion. Typically, the use of post-mortem matter such as blood, blood-stained sheets, or used surgical thread to make the life of the corpse visible in public space. The photographic work in this installation, however, also focuses on sensation, the trans sex workers in relation to surrounding scenes of detrition within which they pose in fashion photography-like poses. So question 3. Next slide, please. At this point in the paper, I examined Margolis' pistas de baile to propose an alternative frame for understanding the causes and effects of feminicide, specifically feminicide that is slow and involves the embodied complexities of trans subjectivity and embodiment while experiencing displacement, derision, and detrition. So next slide, please. Here I will begin with Gaidi, Pista de Baila de la Cervecería Los Compadres. Here, Gaide is posed on the dance floor in front of a partially raised building and before a pile of detritus. Here, Margolis' work forces the viewer to encounter necro-subjection, which Gilberto Rosas defines as, quote, representing those who are made and who make themselves dead in order to live, end quote. So next slide, please. If we turn to Vanessa, Pista de Baile, del group Eduardo's, this photo illustrates the materiality of displacement and the resulting stark exposure of the violence, displacement, destruction, and death that has ravaged Ciudad Juárez, which the razing of buildings within this Centro Histórico revealed. Literally, the erasure of the landscape made life bare. Sex workers no longer had the deteriorating buildings, bars, alleyways, corridors, and shadows to both find safety and to work in. The photos reveal the affective contours of loss that mark the present, future losses not yet here, and the vitalism of a now far past. When encountering the scenes of destruction and detritus in Margolis' photographs, I argue that the detrital remnants represent a past history of vice, debauchery, and pleasure, and can also conversely represent the vicissitudes of the destruction, derision, and detrition of trans life on the US-Mexico border. Next slide, please. I find it imperative to ask, who is the protagonist of these photographs? Are they the trans sex workers whose gaze meets ours as we look at them, or is it the detritus, the ruins that comprise the landscape, settings, backgrounds, and stages to these subjects? At this point, it is necessary to inform you that all the women photographed by Margolis are no longer living. Their deaths must be considered for knowing this, the photos become a capture of death in process, and we are forced to bear witness. Let me focus in on the word detritus. Definitions of interest from the Oxford English Dictionary include an accumulation of debris of any sort, waste or disintegrated material of any kind, debris, matter produced by detrition or wearing away of exposed surfaces, and finally, wearing away or down by detrition, disintegration, decomposition. So I want to conceptually explore this detritus to better account for how we can think through the visuality of the demolished buildings, piles of dirt and gravel and trash that we encounter in the photos. If detritus represents a process of detrition, a wearing down, specifically decomposition, then perhaps it becomes important to think of the detrition of La Mariscal, and specifically the ruins of the bars that are now the detritus pictured in the photos, is actively engaged in a process of decomposition. Margolis' photos that feature slowness and stillness contrast with the moving of matter, the active process of decomposition of the rubble, but also detrition via displacement and disposition that resulted from the razing of the Centro Histórico as part of the process of gentrification. In these photos, the ruins become the active agents, and the figures of the women, figuratively, are the architecture. Their statuesque poses holding up the scene, monuments in and of themselves even. The lines between what is living, what counts as living, and that which are objects is blurred. The ruins stand in for enigmatic visual metonyms for what has now vanished and what Lisa Lowe understands as, quote, the metaphoricity of globalization, end quote, which she defines as the, quote, rhetorical proliferation of figures that attend to the desire to render what is not yet fathomed as objectively known, end quote. In rehearsing the numbers associated with quantifying violence through body counts, unemployment rates, arrests that lead to the destruction of La Mariscal and the displacement of its denizens, the ruins are a figure that, quote, thematizes and the aesthetic and epistemological predicament of globalization itself, in which a ruin's vanishing materiality alludes to the violent loss and deterritorialization that are the conditions for desire to reflect, mourn, and remember. If these portraits are allegories for what are allegories that signify more than a specific loss or individual destruction, at the surface they allude to an excess beyond their manifest or surface content with a finite order or meaning end at a deeper register. The erosion of time when paired with the trans subjects in these photos radically shifts senses of normative embodiment of both the landscape and the figures that traverse it. Misery, extraction, and destruction of disposition and violence are connoted or metaphorized in the ruins, and not through the bodies of the trans subjects in the photographs. I understand these photographs as capturing the process of a slow vanishing of materiality. This enables an analysis to consider how transness interfaces with space and processes of mattering. Lisa Lowe's discussion of Walter Benjamin is instructive here to answer the question of what precisely these snapshots do. According to Lowe, Benjamin notes that ruins are allegories of this dialectic of modernity, inaugurating a process, sensibility, and reflection on such ambivalence against the symbol that affirms the contained totality of truth, beauty, and morality. Benjamin posed allegory which alludes to meaning beyond itself and reckons dialectically and open-endedly with the barbarism of civilization, end quote. Here the tension at play is the tension between progress and leisure. Allegories lead the reader and viewer to an excess, to the world-making possibilities beyond or outside the relations of the work or object itself. Allegory reckons with and defies the violence of the historical and generic conventions that insist on a single universal order of being in the world. Finally, in Lisa Yonemaya's work on the ruins of Hiroshima, she notes, quote, reckoning with ruins is a space of criticism, a, quote, resurrected site of storytelling where one begins to ask how the original loss was produced, if in fact the loss was inevitable, and what is at stake in remembering and forgetting the past, end quote. So as I conclude this talk, I want you to hold on to Yoneyama's phrase, resurrected site of storytelling. It can be easy to see how sex work in a city enthralled by ongoing spectacular terror can render sex workers as subjects, which society must be defended against. What I am specifically asking us to lean into is a suggestion that there is a way these photos might ask us to look towards these subjects that are always already forgotten, dead, on their way to death, to teach us about loss, refusal, and vitalism. These subjects from generation to generation of trans sex workers to the trans migrants living in Juarez awaiting their asylum hearings know how to reckon and navigate the orders of violence that are intractable, normative, normalized. These photos leave us to interpret the ambiguity that lies between pain and pleasure. In these photos, what it means not to live, but rather what it means to avoid transgression and death, and the limits of the body and body identities. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Dr. Bernadine Hernandez.
First of all, I just want to thank you all for being here today. I know that things in our world are very heavy and have been for quite a while, so I want to thank you for making time to be in community with me to think through some of these issues of migration and intersectionality on the U.S.-Mexico border. I will be talking about prostitutes as well, so lots of prostitutes today. Secondly, I want to thank the organizers of this conference, particularly Dr. McCormick for your generous invitation to come and speak and for starting a new friendship. So today I'm going to be talking and thinking about the brown feminine on the U.S.-Mexico border as connected to migration, immigration law, and violence. So for as long as I can remember, I've been interested in thinking about how poor Mexicanas on and near the U.S.-Mexico border are connected through capital. Second slide. So my family, my father is from El Paso, Texas, and for all of my young life, we traveled back and forth from where I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to El Paso, Texas every month. I remember it being such a mundane action, and I didn't really start thinking about my ability to traverse space until I got much older. Back and forth from the border of El Paso and Juarez to the South Valley of Albuquerque, New Mexico, to be honest, I was always a bit resentful that my father made us go constantly to El Paso to visit, to take my grandmother to the doctor in Juarez, and stay for long periods of time to visit his friends. And then 1995 came, and with that year, a lot changed with our visits. NAFTA had just been signed into full effect, and there was a much more militarized presence in the place that I called my second home. We were no longer able to cross freely into Juarez and come back, and coming back was even a bigger ordeal. Women had been being killed there for years, but they were just becoming well known as the women of Juarez or the Juarez feminicides. And we really only started to know about these women because of the free trade agreement that had been solidified in 1995. And migration was up 200% on the border, so people could no longer ignore the dying women anymore. Why do people hate Mexican women so much, I began to think in my teenage years? Why are they being killed at such high rates? Slide 3. Fast forward to 2009, and a woman walking her dog on the West Mesa in Albuquerque found a human bone and called the police. Further investigation revealed a shallow mass gravesite containing the remains of 11 women's bodies and a fetus. After a prolonged excavation, it took almost a year to identify all the victims. Jamie Varela, Monica Candelaria, Victoria Chavez, Virginia Cloven, Sylviana Edwards, Cinnamon Elks, Doreen Marquez, Julie Nieto, Veronica Romero, Evelyn Salazar, and Michelle Valdez. These women are most notably known as the West Mesa murders. When the people of Albuquerque and surrounding communities heard about the mass gravesite, it reminded many of the uncannily similar instances of mass feminicides happening across the border in Ciudad Juarez. Just 4 hours away, poor Mexicanas were being killed and left in the desert as well. And while Albuquerque is not a border town, the Southwest Borderlands as a region informs the historical and gender codes that create border discourse and law, a place that has shifted many times between colonial and imperial powers, but has a long historical lineage in the changes of borders and boundary making. So today, I'd like to briefly talk about the sexual history of the U.S.-Mexico border and how we got to this moment of violence in these cross-national feminicides. I want to think through how women's bodies, through migration and immigration law, in the borderlands are linchpins in the capitalist transformation of the West and the Southwest. So I'm often asked why I center sex. How does capital produce race and sex as an intersection of violence that at once extracts value from poor, brown, feminized bodies while simultaneously rendering them worthless before the law? Sex, and by extension gender, is a technology of power that produces capital and racialization. While contemporary scholars have theorized sex, sexuality, and gender as identity categories, I destabilize that line of thinking by exploring the material consequences of sex and the categories in the society. Next slide. So let me just exemplify this really quick by briefly talking historically about one of the chapters in my book titled The Technology of Unproductive Brown Bodies, the Political Economy of Prostitution and Racialized Sexual Pathology in Arizona at the turn of the century. So this is Gay Alley in Tucson, Arizona, which was the red light district until around 1912, and is now where the convention center and the police department are housed. Next slide, please. So my talk today takes up how sex and sexuality become heavily tied to immigration law at the turn of the century, while becoming pathologized and violent for Mexican women who practice prostitution, which went from volitional and productive to dangerous and unproductive. So during the progressive era from about 1890 to 1920s, the local policing, moral reform politics, and immigration law took down red light districts everywhere. And while prostitution in Tucson, Arizona aided in building the city through local ordinances that charged the women for existing, they charged them for health screenings, they charged them rent, they charged them licensing fees for their housings. And so these fees went actually to building the city of Tucson. Things shifted for Mexican prostitutes on the border when their occupation became de jure, non-consensual, and racist in the early 1900s. So this was tied to whiteness through moral reform and federal immigration laws that were instituted locally, and Arizona prostitutes that were Mexican were pathologized because of their racialized sexuality and foreignness in the country. The racialization of sex in the borderlands became tied to a discourse of unproductiveness instead of the thriving political economy it had been attached to for decades before in Arizona. So the border was really porous for Mexican women to cross back and forth for work and prostitution in both locales until local officials in Arizona and national immigration officers began to slowly imagine a space free of sexual excess and foreigners simultaneously. So while Mexicans crossing the border were not the national target of immigration control in the 19th and early 20th century, Mexican women in Arizona became targeted for prostitution in the first decade of the 20th century through conversations that were taking place at the national level regarding statehood tied to moral reform laws, anti-Chinese immigration law projected onto Mexican prostitutes, and the targeting of males for deportation that made Mexican women vulnerable to deportation because of sexual excess. So what I'm really trying to argue here is to debunk the present scholarship on the origins of the violent militarization of the border against the entry of Mexicans. And scholars will usually say that it came with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1917. However, I pinpoint the dangerously sexual pathologization process of Mexican prostitutes being targeted for racialized sexual excess in 1909. So this story that I'm trying to talk about in terms of the prostitution tied to immigration law is this history of a sexual history, right, of the U.S.-Mexico border that is tied to violence. And so I really turn to the archive to think about this. So I deal with over 100 Arizona territorial newspapers. I deal with the subcommittee on the Committee of Territories on House Bill 12543 of 1902. I deal with immigration memos and letters from the National Archives and Records Administration. And lastly, what I'm going to end this talk with is I deal with the Gustav Schneider Prostitution and Photography Archive at the Arizona Historical Society. And so, next slide, please. So this prostitution archive is really interesting because it really thinks through, it exemplifies the history of prostitution in Arizona at the turn of the century. So these prostitution photographs were taken by Gustav Schneider. He was born in Contra Costa County, California in 1885, and he studied art and architecture at Mark Kopickin's art school before moving to Oakland, California, and then to Tucson, Arizona in 1902, where he worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad Engineering Department from 1903 to 1948. So during his career, he designed bridges for the railroad, including the Rio Fuerte Bridge in Mexico, and he's also a cultural consultant and Arizona historian. In fact, he served as the technical consultant to Columbia Pictures during the filming of the movie Arizona in 1940, and he assisted the Tucson Daily Citizen with preparations of its Arizona album column by identifying historic photographs and providing historical information. And so while he's collecting all of this information for the film and the drawing of the maps of Arizona, he becomes very interested in prostitutes. Don't ask me why. And so he starts taking pictures of local prostitutes between 1912 and 1913, and he keeps a roster of all of these prostitutes, which is really interesting. He lists their legal name. I don't think that he even knew their legal name. And then he lists their prostitute name. And then he lists their ethnicity. Most of them are Mexican, some of them are German, some of them are Irish. He has a Yaqui Indian on there. It's a very interesting roster that he has. But this was an important time for Arizona prostitutes because state had changed their status and position of power. So he really visually represents the prostitutes in Gay Alley and portrays these contours of racialized prostitution on the borderlines by visually exemplifying the prostitution hierarchy and representing the shift from the power of prostitution to the pathology when it becomes dangerous for women to practice prostitution on the border. And so this is one of his first photos that you could tell she is more of like a high-end prostitute because she's stylized and she's in a chair. If you could go to the next slide, please. And this is Carmen. She's my gal. She's my homegirl. We travel together a lot. I'm very interested in this photo of Carmen. She's the cover of my book also. And this photographic archive begs the audience to question, who is Carmen? We don't know anything about Carmen. The back of this photo says Carmen ? And so he didn't know her last name. But in looking for information about Carmen, I came across 3 records that could possibly be her. However, that didn't really matter. What mattered about the Carmen photograph is the spectral presence of border crossing, sexual leveraging, and racialized sex. So Carmen did not want me to figure out exactly who she was, whether she was Carmen Calles of Hermosillo, Sonora, Carmen Verdugo, the Mexican woman who ended up marrying a minor by the name of Henry Barmore, or Carmen Riotera. Carmen did not want to be found, and everything I needed to know about her was in the photo. So the Carmen photograph is, as Miles Orwell states, an accepted representation because it is convincing, not more truthful. This convincing representation becomes what's real in the imagination of society. Carmen, a Mexican woman, stands in for all the other Mexican prostitutes to the dark, musky photograph that becomes representative of how Mexican prostitutes look in this space. So this photo is dark, almost as if the positive space of the photograph has been transferred to negative space. Carmen has a dismal look on her face. She sits on a bed, and there is a mirror vanity in the background that never catches her in its reflection. The absence in the vanity set mirrors quite literally the ghostly haunting of the lives lost and affected by the intersection of empire, sex, and race. In counter-distinction to the post-studio photos that you saw in the other slide, this photo is the fugitive photo in the bunch, the one that seems like it does not belong. Though her gaze is still, she never arrives at stillness because of the position she occupies on the bed. Our gaze goes right to her leg, which is half off and half on the bed, as if she's going to be stepping off soon to continue her day, to continue her work. The lens provides a soft focus that juxtaposes the dark lighting, and this photograph is not stylized while Carmen is not frozen in time. The symbolism of her photo represents the technology of power that many Mexican prostitutes experienced crossing the border at the turn of the century. So reading Carmen photograph in the darkness of her crib evokes the discursive meaning of Mexican prostitutes crossing the border, the excess of the negative, the darkness, the emptiness, and the absence. Carmen makes meaning across time, even at the very same time that we know very little about her. So there's much more work to be done in uncovering a history of sexual violence towards women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, trans and gender nonconforming people in the borderlands. And probably more important, there is much more work to be done to create a trans-feminist connection to keep each other safe. The violent systems and constructions of racialized sex, sexuality, and gender that inform the sexual history that I examine in this talk today and in my book present us with an opportunity to enter into the fissures of that violence. These fissures can offer us new possibilities of collective action, mutual aid, and alternative worlds, because as cliche as the saying goes, another world is possible. Thank you.
And next we have Dr. Luis Rivera.
Hello everyone, good afternoon, or good morning, which one is it? I don't know, one of them. Well, my name is Luis Romero and I'm an assistant professor here at Queerness, and today I'll be presenting to you, thank you Dr. Mack, today I'll be presenting my presentation titled The Queer Detainee Empowerment Project and Abolitionist Movements Against Immigration Detention. And so before I get started, I did want to just offer a content warning, because I do make some brief, but nevertheless still make mentions to sexual violence and self-harm, particularly which that occurs in detention. So if you need time or space to leave the room or to step out, please feel free to do so. But to kind of begin, the question that I want to kind of engage with you all today is, how can we organize around an intersectional abolitionist movement to gain liberation for migrants who are queer, racialized, and oppressed? And to do so, there's going to be sort of three sections or three other kind of mini questions that I want to engage with to kind of get us to start our conversation. And the first one is to really think about what we're up against, especially as it pertains to immigration detention, how we can imagine an intersectional abolitionism, and then what we can do to work towards that. So to begin, in terms of thinking about what we're up against, the framework that I want to think about as it pertains to detention is to think about it as a violent space. And one migrant that we'll be returning to by the name of Laura Monterosa described her experience in detention by the following quote that you see in front of you, where she said, "I do not feel safe or secure. I'm not receiving the medical treatment or help I need." Another migrant named Sandra described her experience in detention by saying, "Everything I went through to cross the border does not compare to what happens to you in a detention center." And the reason why I think you know how you can't walk and chew gum at the same time? That's me. All right, so in terms of thinking about in terms of thinking about Sandra and Laura's description in detention, I think it's important to take a step back and really think about how we got to where we are regarding our situation with detention as a carceral space. And this is a sort of recent phenomenon, as you can see in the graphic behind me. In 1978, about 40 years ago or so, there was only a few dozen detention centers that existed throughout the country. But as we get closer to 2020 and where we are today, we see an explosion in the number of detention sites all across the country, which mirrors our incarceration boom. Just like with our carceral system, the United States is the largest detainer of migrants in the entire world. And so with that comes a lot of the similar carceral logics that we find in the criminal legal system and in the carceral system as a whole, where we see violence and we see different forms of punishment that are instituted within detention. And so part of this can be understood through what Juliet Stump calls crimmigration, which is a combination of words of crime and immigration. And really this is supposed to help us understand how the criminal, legal, and carceral systems have combined with immigration enforcement, both in terms of policy, but also in terms of actions and the actors that are involved in the creation of this mass detention system. And this can probably best be seen in the types of sites in which migrants are detained. As you can see in the image in front of you, the jails are often a very popular space where migrants are detained. Here we see a police officer that also has ice on their jacket, which really helps hopefully drive home the point in terms of how immigration and carceral systems have merged. Former prisons have been converted, just like the one behind you. Former private prisons have been converted also into detention sites all across the country. In many cases, those former prisons that went bankrupt or were having a hard time keeping capacity were able to stay alive by entering into detention contracts with ICE and other immigration agencies. But one of the things that is particularly problematic about this is that many of these various sites of imprisonment, of incarceration of migrants, is that the entire staff, the entire logics that existed when they were prisons remain the same. So the same guards, the same contracts that were established, and so on and so forth, the same relations essentially remain the same. So it should come to no surprise to all of us when we see headlines and reports on the rampant sexual and physical violence that occurs within detention. As this headline behind shows, right, thousands of children were reported to have been sexually assaulted when they were detained. And in another report by The Intercept, we see how the ways in which ICE has been responsible for over half of these assaults within detention. And when you combine Border Patrol and ICE, they accounted for over 70% of all of the sexual assaults that occurred under the Department of Homeland Security as a whole. And on top of this, we know that, you know, in addition to sexual violence, there are other carceral conditions that we see within detention that really make it that violent space, where that is the fact that people are imprisoned, exploited labor, rotten and inconsistent food, insufficient health care, and solitary confinement, which in this context is actually very illegal since detention is not considered a punishment, right? Migrants haven't been through court and been sentenced. And so this is to say that the same conditions that we find within carceral spaces are also found in detention. But to kind of give a more, you know, we're taking a broad view now, to give a kind of more honed in view on how this violence occurs, particularly as it pertains to the queer community and queer migrants that are detained. I want to spend some time talking about Laura, one of the migrants that I shared a quote with at the beginning of this presentation. And Laura is a migrant who fled El Salvador because she was fleeing sexual and physical violence. So her goal was to migrate to the United States, seek asylum and protection, given the violence that she faced. However, upon arriving to the United States, she was quickly detained and was detained for 9 months in a detention center near Austin, Texas. And during this time, Laura faced various forms of harassment and sexual violence at the hands of a detention guard at this detention site. And so one of the things that, as you can see from the third bullet point here, that we know regarding Laura's experience regarding this guard that was harassing her, Laura told this guard, or she reportedly told this guard in a letter that she wrote, that she would report this guard to her supervisor, and the guard responded by saying, you know, do you think the captain will ever believe you? Please, they never will. And this case, and has been revealed in other cases of sexual violence has been reported, detention, as we know, is a black box. It's very hard to enter and to really try to expose in terms of the many specific abuses that happen within its walls. And to sort of make the situation worse, Laura was able to see a counselor while detained, but this counselor didn't offer much support or any help. If anything, she helped this counselor reduce much of the violence that we see within detention. So the reason why Laura had to talk to this counselor was because she began to skip meals as a result of her assault, primarily because Laura knew that if she left her detention cell, that she would have to confront and run into this guard. And so as a result, she stopped going to the cafeteria, stopped going to eat. And so this prompted this counselor to have a session with her. And you can see there's a redacted report, which you can't really make out, but I have some quotes that highlight some of the real issues that occurred with Laura's case. And so as Laura began to report to this counselor the violence that was enacted on her and why she refused to eat and go to the cafeteria area, the counselor responded by saying, I'm not going to discuss your case with you. And just so that you understand, if you miss 2 meals again, I'll be talking to you once again. And so what happened is Laura, as a result, ended up doing an interview with the Austin Chronicle to report on her case, where she told her interviewer that she was very desperate as a result of the counselor not helping her, the guard being a constant presence, and knowing that no one was going to help her. As a result of this, she survived a suicide attempt because of due to the lack of help that was given to her, and then as a result was placed in solitary confinement, which I think if you remember Kyrie's presentation and his discussion of Shay Diamond while Shay was imprisoned, we see how solitary confinement is often used as a space, particularly as we think through how queer and trans people are incarcerated, how it's used to justify this protection. But in reality, as we know, especially in the case of Laura and other people who face violence, this only exacerbates that even more so. So one of the questions as I think about Laura's experience and so many other queer and trans migrants who face detention and violence within detention is, how can we imagine an intersectional abolitionism within these confines? And I want to spend this next part of my presentation talking about the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, or QDEP as I'll refer to for the remainder of this presentation. And QDEP is a immigrant rights organization, or it began, I should say, as an immigrant rights organization that was really concerned with helping migrants who were detained and those migrants in their post-release life. But one of the interesting things about QDEP, as you dig a little bit more into them, as you read things like their mission statement and kind of their philosophy on how they conceptualize their organization, is that they're really concerned with not just immigration or detention really as their primary focus, but they're also focused on more structural issues, kind of aiming more towards an abolitionist philosophy of focusing on overall wellness, education, legal and emotional support, and other services that people need to be whole and to survive and thrive after their time in detention. What's particularly important about this organization as well is that they take on this intersectional perspective as it pertains to how they view migrants and the migrants they work with, and even the members who are part of the organization to begin with. So again, as you can see from their mission statement, I'll show a few examples of how they practice this. But as you can see from their mission statement here, their real focus is, and their priority is on helping migrants that are from the LGBTQIA, trans, gender non-conforming community, and obviously those who obviously intersect with being undocumented and being detained or formerly detained as a way to gain their liberation. So I want to just introduce this group quickly at this point because I wanted to sort of position them as an aspirational form of abolitionism, and one in which begins with discussing and thinking about immigration and detention, to then expand beyond that to thinking about what a world could look like without detention and without carcerality. So I want to share with you all now a few flyers and a few images that were produced by QDEP that I think really capture some of their philosophies and aims and the ways in which they work to create an abolitionist future for themselves and for migrants and the trans community and the queer community. And so here we see a flyer, right, of a block party that they had in which they obviously announced very proudly, right, that this is an abolitionist block party. They, at the bottom, I don't know if you can make it out, right, basically, discussing Rikers as a death camp and critiquing Eric Adams, right, the New York mayor currently, who is very much engaged in carceral practices. But in addition to that, we see how when we think of migrants and we think of abolishing detention, oftentimes the focus on this has been primarily on Latinx migrants and the Latinx community. And we can understand part of the reason for this given the sheer numbers of the demographics of migrants who are detained. But one of the ways in which QDEP tries to reorient this is by centering queer and trans migrants, and by also, if you can make out the caption, really positioning themselves, again, as an abolitionist organization. But beyond that, I think the other really important intervention that QDEP makes is by also centering Blackness and Black transness and Black queerness in how they're doing their work. So this is a fairly recent post that they had during Black History Month, right, that just ended a week or so ago. And here, they're really highlighting the importance of not only celebrating Black History Month, but really centering the role that Black, queer, and trans migrants have had in trying to end detention, in trying to advocate for migrants, and to really make sure that that's celebrated and recognized and incorporated into how they practice their abolitionism. So here we see another flyer from an event from February 24th of this year, right? Where they're really trying to center, as you can see from the title, Black future things, right? And I don't know if you can make out, but there's a kind of a caption at the bottom of the title where it says "Standing in Solidarity with Black Trans Lives," where they again are trying to capture that intersectional perspective of celebrating people from the Caribbean, people who are trans, immigrants, and imagining radical futures. Another way in which this was done, right, is in the ad campaign for Paul White, who is a queer migrant who was detained for over almost 2 years, and some of the work that they really tried to do around making sure that Paul's story was known, and making sure that not only his name was known by the community and by other activists, but again, trying to center his queerness and also trying to highlight the ways in which Black migrants are also subjected to detention. The other ways in which we can see how this form of, or how QDEP works to take on this intersectional lens and intersectional abolitionism is in the work that they do outside of the United States and the advocacy work that they focus on that takes on a transnational flavor. So here we see a flyer that is advocating for end of police brutality in Nigeria. And one of the things that you'll see with these next few slides is that QDEP is really focusing in on how abolitionism and how a world without police violence and a world in which trans and queer communities can thrive are seen across the world. So here, this next slide, you see a flyer for a meeting to discuss trans activists in Uganda, being portrayed. And this next slide, you see a call for thinking of abolitionism in concert with Palestinian liberation. So working towards, I don't have the slides here, but there's other movements and images in which you see QDEP advocating for Palestinian lives, going out to protests and sharing links and resources for donations and providing support for Palestinians. But beyond that, the mission I wanted to kind of come back to in a second before going back and expanding out to thinking about how abolitionism works under a model that QDEP presents is thinking about the role that its founding charter had. And one of the ways in which QDEP really began was in thinking of how they can provide support for migrants in detention. And QDEP is part of a larger network of detention visitation programs that try to help migrants who are detained. One of the ways they do this is through a pen pal system, right, where they write people in detention and try to understand their stories, try to provide emotional support, but also try to understand some of the abuses that occur while people are in detention. And so here are just some different flyers, right, of different events where they have these pen pal writing nights where people gather to write letters to migrants. But more importantly than that, one of the things that organizations like QDEP do is work to release migrants from detention. So coming back to Laura's story, who I began with this presentation, through the organizations or a similar organization like QDEP, Laura was able to gain her release from detention thanks to another abolitionist organization. And so the reason, or the way in which this happened was one of these visitation programs was able to enter detention, talk with Laura, her story was shared, And through that, the organizing really began. So there was a big media campaign that occurred that was covered by the Washington Post and NPR. There was political pressure applied where local politicians from the state, including Beto O'Rourke and Joaquin Castro, really started to amp up pressure to their fellow congressmen to release Laura and to avoid, or in their case, in terms of Republicans and other people who normally don't care, to really save themselves embarrassment, right? They worked to release Laura in that sense. There's a lawsuit that was filed in which ICE admitted in federal court that they provide substandard care and did for Laura in her case. And this ultimately resulted in the release of Laura and also gaining a visa to prevent her deportation. So the reason why I wanted to highlight QDIP and to, again, think about how they envision abolitionism, beginning with migration and expanding beyond that, is that QDIP is also focused on other things that people need beyond escaping detention. They host numerous food distribution drives, as you can see here. Or when COVID first began, they had various campaigns that, as you can see from the bottom right-hand corner, focus on things that are specific to detention, like providing funds for the commissary, but also thinking of other rights and other needs that people have, such as rent support, utility support, foodways, and mental health care. And so because of these various projects that QDIP and other organizations like it are focused on, I want to sort of wrap up, or begin to wrap up, by considering a quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore that I think connects well to Abdul's comments regarding abolitionism, and that's that when we think of abolitionism, or to read from the quote, insofar as abolitionism is imagined only to be absence, overnight erasure, the knee-jerk response is, that's not possible. But the failure of imagination rests in missing the fact that abolitionism isn't just absence. Abolition is a freshly and material presence of social life lived differently. And so to kind of connect to Abdul's comments on how we can imagine abolitionism, I do think that when we think of abolitionism, we should think about it through a lens of radical care, as QDIP and other organizations have thought of, right? Thinking of it as a holistic, as a holistic project, as opposed to just we're ending detention and that's sort of the end of that. But also thinking about, as Gilmore also said in another context, how abolitionism is not just about destroying buildings or the spaces in which people are incarcerated or detained, but rather reorienting our social relations. And so to conclude and wrap up, one of the questions I always ask myself is, how can we work towards this? And how can we, come closer or try to replicate or envision our own version of an intersectional abolitionism as QDIP has done? And so in our local context, some of you may be familiar or maybe not, but there's one of the, I guess, more prominent detention sites in the DFW area is one called Prairie Land, which is in Alvarado, Texas, about 20 minutes, 30 minutes south of here. And what's particularly salient or important about this detention site is that they have a specific section just for trans migrants to be detained in. And so this, as you can imagine, has caused many problems in terms of the treatment and the lack of care that trans migrants receive within detention. And so as a result of this, one of the questions I ask myself is, what can we do to, again, replicate things like QDIP and other organizations that are working towards this type of intersectional abolitionism? And so I'll just end with a recruitment pitch here. I and some local people are working to create a visitation program. Again, we're starting with thinking of migration as our kind of starting point, but building it out to thinking of abolitionism in all these different ways. So this, if you scan this QR code, we're going to start our very first meetings very soon. So we're literally at the ground floor. And really looking for different voices and different people who would like to be part of some of these meetings. If you click on that, just ask for basic contact info. And if you're interested in being listed on some correspondence, many of the organizers who are part of this effort are people who are formerly with United Fort Worth and Raices. I know some representatives are with us here tonight. or today I should say. And so if you're interested, right, in continuing this conversation and seeing what this can look like on a local level, we welcome you all to help us build, because again, we're literally at the ground floor. Meeting one hasn't even happened yet, so really hope that you can help us envision what this project can look like. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we get a round of applause for all of the panelists? Next, we're going to Q&A, but I do have just one question. I think we could just lead into this from what each one of you ended with and thinking about the future, the alternative life, what it could look like for LGBTQ plus IA folks, and the research you're producing, the writing you're doing. What are your thoughts on the future and alternative ways that we see this work being produced? If you guys maybe want to touch a little bit on that by chance. Any questions, anybody?
For me, I guess I'll give an example that's rooted in, we're thinking about contemporarily what things have changed for trans sex workers in Mexico. So recently, the state of Chihuahua has made it possible for people who are not assigned female at birth, right, to register with the proper health offices to have their paperwork to engage in sex work, because sex work is legal in various cities and parts of Mexico, right? So prior to the research, to the time period that I've been doing, right, trans women were not able to register to have their paperwork in order, and this made them susceptible to police violence and harassment because it was illegal for them to be engaging in sex work. And so, that's kind of where are we now in relationship to the work. And so I think the decriminalization of sex work is a really big part of making life better for these folks. And for me, in these narratives, the women, so what I didn't show were some photographs from the 90s where these women are very actively having pleasure in the work that they do and the existences they have with being part of another cohort of women as they're living together, trans migrant women who are living together. So I think that there's a sense of enjoyment, a sense of family that is created in these instances, in these communities that people are coming together because they are doing sex work. So I think, not pathologizing that type of labor becomes particularly important, and also, solutions like enabling folks to have the paperwork in order, right, is participating with the state, but it also enables a particular class of people to be able to do the work and the labor that they want to in a safer way, but it's not the solution, right? So really kind of having more conversations about the depathologization of sex work and how we might imagine a place in which sex work is something that we can readily talk about in relationship to labor and labor struggles and things like that. So in this particular project, that's kind of where what I'm thinking about.
For me, in terms of gender and sexual violence on the border, I see hope in the future through the grassroots organizations that I work with, and these kind of like binational organizations that are working transnationally, across nations, across borders. And as much as I hate social media, I think that social media has been a great foundation for organizers to get together and to think about alternative ways of being. And so I see a lot of social media campaigns that connect organizers across different grassroots organizations and borders. And so I think that that's the hope that I see. I don't necessarily see like the nation state. We already have laws, quote unquote, to protect women against gender and sexual violence, but those laws are not usually enacted. So I don't think that we put the hope in the nation state or in any of those institutions of violence, but instead put the hope in the people.
Yeah, in the case of detention, it can be a bit tricky sometimes, because one of the things that many anti-detention workers often advocate for is, well, if we don't want people to be in detention, maybe a better alternative is ankle monitors, right, or ankle bracelets. Because at least that way, people won't be detained anymore, right? They'll get to go home and they'll, have an opportunity to, be away from, again, guards and all the violence that exists within detention. But I think it's, some of your actions from me even saying the word ankle braces, we see some of the issues that arise with that as an alternative or as a kind of a goal to tend detention is to use these ankle monitors, particularly because in the case of, immigration, many of the private companies that run and operate these detention sites are the ones that are buying up all of these like small ankle bracelet monitoring surveillance, companies, because they know they can kind of hedge their bet. Well, if detention fails, then we'll have this as a sort of backup to our current business model. And so in terms of thinking of what future can look like, my hope is that organizations like QDEP can work more towards releasing migrants and ending detention, period. I think that's the ideal future to work towards, and abolishing immigration enforcement, ICE, but in terms of the more short term, I think that avoiding that pothole is something that is, I think, an ongoing conversation to try to think of a better alternative, a better future.
Any questions? You want me to stand up?
Yeah, stand up.
Okay.
But I have a specific question. You know how abortion has recently been.
Thank you. You know how abortion has recently been legalized in Mexico, and I wanted to know if you guys have had any research findings or have seen the impacts of it on the sexual violence that the trans community faces, because I know that's something that's always very important to take into factor when intersectionality is mentioned.
I mean, I think that there is still like an existing division between, certain feminists who don't see trans women as part of or aligned in their movements, right? So I think that those divisions still exist, but I think that reproductive rights becomes a central place where trans folks and folks who are trans who are not assigned female at birth, right, can have solidarity or can engage in coalitional politics together. Because I think of issues of abortion and for trans folks issues to documentation, whether it's documentation or sex reassignment surgery, right? Like this is about how the state is regulating bodies in fundamental ways. So having the conversation about like what access to sexual reassignment surgery might look like in relationship to rights for abortion, right? Forces to have a conversation about the decisions we get to make about our bodies in different types of ways. So I know that folks are having those conversations and have those existing solidarities, but I would say that we're still living in a time in which there is a moral panic around what trans people represent in relationship to this imagined stability or unchanging understanding of what gender itself as a concept is and sex as a category to categorize by virtue of the state. But in Mexico, you can, though, change your gender designation depending on what state you live in. So that also depends on where you live as well. But I don't know if that fully answered your question, but thank you.
Yeah, it did answer the question. And then especially because I wanted to know, since Mexico has now legalized abortion, but for example, Texas has not. So that's why I wanted to know, like, any, I guess maybe shifts in narratives of where it's like, oh, like, maybe not everyone, right? Like a trans sex worker was like, oh yeah, like I want to go to the US, XYZ, da da da. But now with that being a factor, are they more hesitant or anything like that, or has that not come up yet in your lines of work?
I can't speak for like contemporarily in this moment in terms of like what folks' ideas are around what you get as a trans person coming to the United States. I think trans people who are from the US have very kind of jaded ideas about what is access, but I mean, I think it really depends on what state you end up migrating to and what networks you get connected to. So I think for like the majority of trans people who've always lived in the United States, there's a perception that there's not enough, and I agree that there's not enough. But if you have nothing, right, and to have access to something that's important. I don't wanna criticize that or put that aside, right? Like we take for granted what mechanisms there are. I continue to say there's not enough access to healthcare and just life-affirming things for trans folks in the U.S. The discourse makes it hard to be a trans person in the U.S. But I think we can't necessarily, I think the U.S. and U.S. exceptionalism does a good job of creating this imaginary that you can be whoever you want to be in the United States when that's clearly not the case for everyone. And I do think that the panic around, the moral panic and discourse around gender non-normativity as it is being deployed in the United States as a tool, as a mechanization, for me, I understand that connected to wanting to secure borders, right? Because there's a desire to not let in sexual dissidents in the same way that has kind of happened over time, which we saw from as early as Bernardine's work to the time period that I'm talking about. There's a particular moral panic around sex and gender non-normativity that continues to really kind of frame our policies, whether we want to name it as such or not.
Hey, I have a question for Dr. Hernandez. Thank you so much for your really interesting presentation. I'm wondering if there's any information in the archive about the different kinds of photographic technologies that Schneider was using, because I was really struck by the difference, excuse me, the difference between the posed studio, like the technological difference that you can see in the exposure of the film, the lighting, and that kind of thing. So is there information about that?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. There's not, and I do some, as much as, I mean, I'm not a photography scholar. I just, really got drawn to that archive collection because I was doing work on prostitution, prostitutes and prostitution. And so I do trace kind of like the technology. So I'm looking at the technology of power of sexuality in relation to the technology of power of the photograph too, and how it evolves from 19th century discourse to the turn of the century. And so those post photographs in the studio, those have been like a couple of women in my first chapters from the late 19th century also participated in post photos like that. But when we get to like the Carmen photo with that, like it's kind of almost like double exposure. Those were utilized for like postcards, and so they were like trading cards kind of in Tucson. And so like you had like these prostitution trading cards, and you're like, what's my favorite prostitute? Like we'll all trade, and so that was a different type of technology. I'm not necessarily sure what technology, like what camera was used, but I know that the switch from like the posed studio photographs to this less, kind of like proper photography methods were used for the postcards that were being traded, like around.
Hello, this is a question for all. I'm looking at the title of the panel, and then I'm looking at all of y'all's works, and I was just wondering if y'all would say that y'all's works interact with Bulgaria studies, and how it does, and like where would y'all go with that within that academic discipline? Thank you.
I'll just go first. I use sexuality as a category of materiality. So for me, sexuality is not an identity category in my work. It's very much tied to the material consequences and capital consequences in society. So I would be really interested to see how my work fit into Withidia studies, but it hasn't been a conversation with it because I don't utilize sexuality as like, homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality. That's not my methodology. But I would be really interested to see that.
Yeah, I think that my work is how how we orient sexuality within the context of detention and what that means for trans and queer migrants specifically. So in my case, I primarily engage with abolitionist work in terms of thinking of how migration is kind of the starting point, and then making sure that different migrant groups are captured, or not captured, but are fairly represented in within those studies, given the overrepresentation of straight and Latinx migrants within that kind of landscape. So I think I actually am positioned similarly to you, Verity, but I think I think that would be a good next space to take it to.
So for me, I would say my first book, Brown Transfigurations, doesn't necessarily engage with Hoteria studies, but I remain not fully convinced that trans embodiments and subjectivity fit under the rubrics of like Hoteria, just because the lineage and the literatures from which Hoteria studies is founded is a literature that is very much I don't want to call it, it's exclusive of trans embodiments, the early literature, right? When we're in the early works of Shuri Moraga, Anzaldúa was probably more inclined to thinking about trans embodiments, but Shuri Moraga's early work and her later work, I do a reading of my book where I kind of demonstrate, because I think her work is important for Chicana feminisms, right? But for like being the backbone of what we might call trans feminisms, I don't necessarily see that being aligned in a way that I'm fully convinced of. So I engage with Hoteria studies to the extent that I am cautious about who gets to be included under that rubric, but I do think that there are people who are doing important work related to trans and queer studies that are more about identity-based, like we exist, right? Like trans people exist, or Jotas and Jotos, this is a word that people use and deploy for political aims and things like that. Like I have a firm belief that there's excellent work that's being done in relationship to that, but my work is not necessarily, like my co-panelists, is less invested in the identity or the enunciation of we exist, and I claim this identity as opposed to what are the social political kind of apparatuses that diminish my life chances or my ability to have a life that aren't necessarily thinking about how I identify or how people identify or not.
We have time for one question?
We are close to time. If we have one more person, I see a person, I see two. So how about we do this? How about we ask both questions and then let the panelists kind of take up so we can get them in the room.
Mine's quick. Luis, I was interested. One of my best friends, Jamila Hamami, is the founder of QDUP. And I haven't done this research on QDUP, but my kind of colloquial understanding of QDUP is that I think we can say it's one of the first, if not the first, that was actively bringing the detention conversation and the prison abolition conversation together in ways that I don't think really had been done before. And I wonder just what you thought about that, or what your kind of genealogical reading of that would be.
Yeah, I'll answer quickly. You're absolutely right. There's entire visitation network throughout the country, and it's run by a California-based organization called Freedom for Immigrants. And if you go to the various, sites or talk to some of the different organizers, their primary focus is on sort of migration rights, and which is important and great. But to your point, I would agree with that take on the genealogy of where QDUP kind of stands in combining those conversations.
Hi, my name is Galo Lopez, and I have, wonderful work from like landscape memories to key characters and their appearances to detainee testimonies. My questions for you there's two. You can answer however you'd like. You're all dealing with temporalities and spaces of perseverance and trauma. How does one enter this realm of memory in regard to pain and perseverance without triggering trauma or producing the savior complex? Another question I have is, all these different characters that you bring up have various spaces. And within those spaces, you are venturing through this archive of their experiences. What other spatial entitlements, like Dr. Galante has brought with these landscapes, what other spatial entitlements have your characters brought to the plate in your research? And where is the next space you're going to venture?
I can just take the first question really quickly. Yeah, in terms of avoiding that savior complex, you know, when we think of organizing, it's organizing with Black and trans migrants. When it comes to QDIP, you know, they're primarily, you know, the leadership, right, and many of the critical members are Black and trans and migrants, and it's even with the other, you know, the visitation programs that exist, many people who are formerly detained end up running or recruiting people to visit detention sites. So I think making sure that, you know, that those groups or the people that we're quote unquote saving are running and have a voice and are part of the organizing, I think is going to be an important piece to that.
That's a really good question and a really loaded question. I think for me, the archive is a really lonely place to be, and so I think that I made friends with these people that I write about, and but I also do believe in ghosts and not unsettling the archive in any type of way. So I don't necessarily tell all of the stories that I found in the archive. I don't tell you necessarily who Carmen is. I don't tell you, you know, like I have a scene of a lynching, a hanging in my book, which I go over in some degree, but I don't tell you in-depthly that. So I think that you have to navigate the archive in that type of way to not unsettle things that are personal and private that don't need to be out there. And I think for me, like the different spaces that I traversed, like you asked the second question, my characters in my book traverse like there's a lot of maps in my book, and I'm not like a geographer, so it was very interesting to see how these maps coincided with the spaces that the people that I write about or the women that I write about occupy. And so I would say like my project is a project of mapping, of maps, like the visual map, but also of mapping people and spaces.
Thank you, such excellent questions and hard to answer, I think. I think for the first question, so I keep talking about what I didn't get to share with you because hopefully it'll be in the book when I write the book. But the archive that I pulled from for looking at the 1990s and the experience of these trans women in the 90s are primarily from the notes and archives of white feminist ethnographers, right? So whether or not I like the fact that these trans women trusted these women, they did, and so I can go back into their notes and kind of flesh out kind of the rhythms of their lives, what their pleasures, what their pains were, and what they were willing to share with these women, and it includes photography as well. So I'm trying to really kind of push up against the fascination with transness that's happening in the 90s as a postmodern kind of invention, and through the eyes of these white feminist kind of saviors, but really trying to rewrite things in a different type of way. And then the second question, for me, I think looking at different complexly gendered case studies is what the second book will continue to do as I did in the first. And what I mean by that is, in the second book, it's dolorous gender, so I'm interested in the space between the ambiguity that exists between pain and pleasure, right? So like there's something that we are uncomfortable with in that ambiguity between pain and pleasure, and I see that tied to how we think about gender as something that's dolorous, something that's hard, something that can be painful, but yet can, through that pain, brings about pleasure. And so that would be like my answer to the second piece in terms of like what are the spaces I'm thinking about, and in this case it's gender as a category still, but the affect around it, like pain and pleasure, or in Spanish, dolor.